Harlem, New York. It was 8:43 p.m. on Saturday, November 7th, 1931, when a peaceful dinner at Le Coq d'Or, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants that had only recently begun admitting wealthy black patrons, transformed into a confrontation that would define the coming war between Harlem's independent numbers operators and Dutch Schultz's criminal organization. The evening had begun pleasantly enough. Stephanie St. Clair, 34, known throughout Harlem as Madame Queen for her control of lucrative policy gambling operations, was dining with Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 26, her protege and enforcer, along with 3 other associates, celebrating a particularly profitable week and discussing expansion plans that would increase their operations into territories that Dutch Schultz considered his own. This was November 1931, before the full-scale numbers war between Schultz and Harlem's independent operators had exploded into open violence, before Schultz's campaign of intimidation and murder would force most black numbers bankers to either surrender their operations or face destruction. There was tension, certainly. Schultz had made clear his intentions to control all gambling in Harlem, but there hadn't yet been the kind of direct confrontation that would characterize 1932 and 1933. St. Clair and Johnson felt safe dining publicly at Le Coq d'Or because they believed Schultz wouldn't risk attacking prominent Harlem figures in a fancy Manhattan restaurant frequented by wealthy white patrons who wouldn't tolerate gangland violence interrupting their meals. They were wrong. According to 6 witnesses who were present at Le Coq d'Or that evening and who spoke with the Harlem Gazette between November 8th and November 10th, 1931, what happened after Bumpy Johnson excused himself to visit the restroom became one of the most infamous incidents in the history of Harlem's numbers wars, not just because of Dutch Schultz's brazen attack on Stephanie St. Clair in a public restaurant, but because of what Bumpy Johnson did in response, and because of what happened to the man who made the fatal mistake of putting his hands on a black woman that Bumpy Johnson was sworn to protect. At approximately 8:45 p.m., Johnson stood from the table and walked toward the restrooms located near the back of the restaurant, leaving St. Clair and the 3 associates, whose names are being withheld at their request, continuing their conversation about business matters. The restaurant was crowded with approximately 60 patrons, mostly white, mostly wealthy, the kind of establishment where violent confrontations simply didn't happen because the clientele wouldn't tolerate such behavior. Approximately 2 minutes after Johnson left the table, at 8:47 p.m., according to multiple witness accounts, Dutch Schultz walked through the main entrance of Le Coq d'Or, accompanied by 4 men, including his bodyguard and enforcer, a large Irish-American named Paddy O'Brien, 32, who was known throughout New York's criminal underworld for his willingness to use extreme violence and for his particular hatred of black people, whom he routinely referred to using the most vile racial slurs. Schultz walked in like he owned the place, says Margaret Richardson, 41, who was dining with her husband 3 tables away from St. Clair's party. Richardson spoke with the Gazette on November 9th, 1931. He was dressed expensively, expensive suit, expensive overcoat, but he had this air of menace about him. He was scanning the restaurant like he was looking for someone specific. And then his eyes stopped on Madame St. Clair's table, and his whole face changed. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was predatory, and he walked directly toward her table with his 4 men following behind him. According to all 6 witnesses, Schultz approached St. Clair's table and stood over her in a position of deliberate intimidation, looking down at the elegant black woman who controlled numbers operations that Schultz wanted to seize. "Well, well, well," Schultz said loudly enough that nearby tables could hear clearly. If it isn't Madam Queen herself, dining in a fancy white restaurant like she belongs here, tell me, Stephanie, do they let racial slur eat off the regular plates here, or do they give you special plates so you don't contaminate the china that white people use? The racial slur caused the entire restaurant to go silent. White patrons at nearby tables looked uncomfortable but said nothing, unwilling to intervene in what was clearly a criminal matter involving dangerous people. St. Clair's 3 associates started to stand, but Schultz's 4 men, including O'Brien, moved to surround the table, hands inside their coats, where weapons were clearly concealed. "Sit down," Schultz ordered St. Clair's associates. "This conversation is between me and the racial slur queen here. The rest of you don't need to die tonight if you stay quiet and stay seated." St. Clair, according to all witnesses, remained completely calm despite being surrounded by 5 hostile men and despite Schultz using racial slurs designed to humiliate her in front of the restaurant's white patrons. She looked up at Schultz and spoke in a voice that was quiet but absolutely clear. "Mr. Schultz, I'm having dinner with friends. Whatever business you think we have can be discussed at a more appropriate time and place. I suggest you leave before you create a scene that embarrasses both of us." Schultz's response, according to witnesses who heard every word, revealed both his rage at St. Clair's refusal to surrender her operations and his belief that as a white man he could terrorize a black woman publicly without consequences. "You, racial slur, don't tell me what to do. You don't suggest anything to me. You're going to sit there and listen while I explain how things work in New York. Harlem's numbers game belongs to me now. Every policy operation, every numbers banker, every runner, they all work for me or they don't work at all. You've been refusing to surrender your operations. You've been telling other racial slur bankers not to work with me. You've been acting like you're something special because you've got money and fancy clothes. But you're just a racial slur from Martinique who forgot her place, and I'm here to remind you of that place." Schultz then did something that caused several women at nearby tables to gasp audibly. He pulled a revolver from inside his coat and placed it on St. Clair's table, spinning it slowly so the barrel pointed at St. Clair, then at her associates, then back at St. Clair. "Nice gun, isn't it?" Schultz said, his voice now carrying throughout the silent restaurant. "I've killed 6 men with this gun, maybe 7. I lose count. You see how easy it would be for me to pick this up and shoot you right here in front of all these nice white people? You see how nobody would stop me? You see how even in this fancy restaurant, a racial slur like you has no protection from a white man like me?" According to witnesses, Schultz picked up the gun and pointed it directly at St. Clair's face from approximately 3 feet away. "When are you going to learn your lesson, Stephanie? When are you going to understand that you can't compete with white men in the numbers game? This is our business. We're taking it from you, racial slurs, because we're smarter and tougher and because we're white and you're not. So I'll ask you one more time. Are you going to surrender your operations to me peacefully, or am I going to have to take them from you by force? And believe me, racial slur, force is something I'm very good at." What happened next, according to all 6 witnesses, shocked everyone in the restaurant, including Dutch Schultz himself. Stephanie St. Clair reached calmly into her purse, pulled out a small .32 caliber pistol, and pointed it directly at Schultz's chest from across the table. "Mr. Schultz," St. Clair said in that same quiet, clear voice, "I'm not going to surrender my operations to you, not peacefully, not by force, not ever. If you think being white makes you superior to me, you're about to learn that being white doesn't stop bullets. Now, I suggest you put your gun down and leave this restaurant before one of us does something we can't take back." For approximately 5 seconds, Dutch Schultz and Stephanie St. Clair pointed guns at each other across the dinner table, while 60 restaurant patrons watched in frozen silence. Witnesses described the tension as unbearable, everyone understanding that if either person pulled their trigger, the resulting gunfight would kill multiple people in the crowded restaurant. "You don't have the guts to shoot me," racial slur, Shultz finally said. "You're a businesswoman, not a killer. You're bluffing." "Try me," St. Clair responded. What broke the standoff, what transformed it from a tense confrontation into something far worse, was Patty O'Brien's decision to intervene. According to witnesses, O'Brien moved quickly from where he'd been standing slightly behind and to the left of St. Clair's position, closing the distance to her in 2 fast steps, and struck her hard across the face with a backhanded blow that knocked her head sideways and sent her gun flying from her hand onto the floor several feet away. "That's how you handle uppity, racial slur," O'Brien said loudly, standing over St. Clair, who was holding her face where O'Brien had hit her, blood trickling from her split lip. "They think they're tough until a real man puts them in their place. This racial slur won't forget who's in charge now." Dutch Schultz laughed, a sound that multiple witnesses describe as genuinely pleased, as if O'Brien's violence against a black woman was entertainment rather than assault. "You see, Stephanie," Schultz said, still laughing, "this is what happens when you forget your place. My man Patty here just taught you a lesson about respect. Maybe next time you'll think twice before pulling a gun on a white man. Maybe next time you'll—" Schultz stopped mid-sentence because something cold and metallic had just pressed against the back of his head, and a voice behind him said quietly, but with absolute menace, "If your white friend touches Madame St. Clair one more time, I'm going to blow your brains out all over this nice restaurant. Drop your gun on the table, now." Bumpy Johnson had returned from the restroom. According to all 6 witnesses, the scene that followed was one of the most tense confrontations any of them had ever witnessed. Bumpy Johnson stood directly behind Dutch Schultz, close enough that the barrel of Johnson's .45 caliber pistol was pressed against Schultz's skull, just above where his spine met his head, the kind of close-range position where missing would be impossible and where a single shot would kill instantly. Schultz's 4 men, including O'Brien, who just struck St. Clair, had their hands on their weapons but hadn't drawn them yet, uncertain whether drawing would trigger Johnson to shoot Schultz before they could shoot Johnson. St. Clair remained seated, holding her bleeding face, looking at O'Brien with an expression that witnesses describe as pure hatred. The 60 restaurant patrons were completely silent, some crawling under tables for cover, some frozen in their seats, all understanding they were witnessing something that could explode into a massacre at any second. "Bumpy Johnson," Schultz said, his voice remarkably calm considering he had a gun pressed to his head. "I should have known you were here, always protecting your queen like a loyal dog. You going to shoot me in front of all these witnesses? You going to spend the rest of your life in prison for killing a white man?" "I'll spend 1 second in prison if it means your racist brain is splattered across this restaurant," Johnson responded. "Now drop your gun on the table like I told you, and tell your man, Patty, the one who just hit Madame St. Clair, to step away from her. Do it now, Dutch, or I pull this trigger and we all find out what the inside of your skull looks like." According to witnesses, Schultz carefully placed his gun on the table. Then he spoke to O'Brien without turning his head. "Patty, step back. Move away from the racial slur. Bumpy here is crazy enough to actually shoot me." O'Brien backed away from St. Clair slowly, his hands raised to show he wasn't reaching for a weapon, his face showing confusion about why Schultz was surrendering to a black man's demands. "Now here's how this is going to work," Johnson said, still holding his gun to Schultz's head. "You and your men are going to walk out of this restaurant. You're going to leave Madame St. Clair alone. You're going to understand that if you ever threaten her again, if you ever call her racial slurs again, if any of your men ever put their hands on her again, I will kill you. Not maybe. Not possibly. I will kill you. Do you understand me, Dutch?" "I understand you're making a big mistake," Schultz responded. "This isn't over, Bumpy. You think you're protecting her, but you're just making things worse. This war you're starting tonight, it's going to destroy both of you." "We'll see," Johnson said. Then he stepped back, removing the gun from Schultz's head but keeping it pointed at him. "Now get out. And Dutch, tell Patty that he made the biggest mistake of his life tonight when he hit Madame St. Clair. Tell him I'm going to remember his face. Tell him he better watch his back every second of every day from now on, because I don't forgive men who hit women I'm sworn to protect." Schultz stood up slowly, picked up his gun from the table, and looked at Johnson with an expression that combined rage and grudging respect. "You got balls, Bumpy, I'll give you that. Stupid balls, but balls. You just made yourself a target. You just made this personal, but I'll give you one piece of advice. Don't come after Patty. He's under my protection. You touch him. You're declaring war on me and my entire organization. You ready for that war?" "I've been ready since you walked in here, calling Madame St. Clair racial slurs," Johnson responded. "Now get out before I change my mind about letting you leave." Schultz and his 4 men, including O'Brien, who kept looking back at St. Clair and Johnson with an expression of pure hatred, walked out of Le Coq d'Or, while every patron in the restaurant watched in silence. Only after they'd left and the door had closed behind them did the restaurant erupt in conversation, with patrons discussing what they'd just witnessed and restaurant staff calling police to report the incident. Johnson immediately went to St. Clair, helped her to her feet, examined her face where O'Brien had struck her. "Your lip is split," Johnson said quietly. "Needs ice. Maybe stitches. We should leave before police arrive and start asking questions neither of us wants to answer." St. Clair nodded, still holding her face, and then said something that Johnson and the 3 other associates at the table all heard clearly. "I want that man found, Bumpy. The one who hit me, Patty O'Brien. I want him found, and I want him to understand that hitting a black woman carries consequences. Can you do that for me?" Johnson looked at St. Clair, saw the determination in her eyes despite the blood on her face, and nodded. "I'll find him, Madame. And when I do, he's going to write a letter to Dutch Schultz explaining why attacking you was the biggest mistake of his life. That's a promise." For 7 days following the November 7th incident at Le Coq d'Or, Bumpy Johnson devoted significant resources to finding Patty O'Brien. According to William "Bub" Hewlett, Johnson's chief of security, who spoke with the Gazette on November 10, 1931, the search involved dozens of Johnson's associates canvassing areas where Schultz's men were known to operate, bribing informants for information about O'Brien's movements, and watching locations where O'Brien had been spotted in the past. Mr. Johnson made finding Patty O'Brien the organization's top priority, Hewlett says. "We had maybe 30 men actively searching, watching bars where Schultz's people drank, watching buildings where his operations ran, talking to people who might know O'Brien's habits." Mr. Johnson was offering $500 to anyone who provided information that led to finding O'Brien. That was serious money in November 1931, more than most people earned in 6 months. The word went out through Harlem and through the Irish neighborhoods where Schultz's people lived. Bumpy Johnson is looking for Patty O'Brien, and he's willing to pay for information. The breakthrough came on November 14th, 1931, exactly 1 week after the Le Coq d'Or incident. An informant contacted one of Johnson's men with information that O'Brien would be at a specific bar in Hell's Kitchen at approximately 9 p.m., meeting associates to discuss collections from Schultz's gambling operations in that neighborhood. "We positioned 6 men near the bar," Hewlett recounts. "Mr. Johnson wanted overwhelming force, so there'd be no chance of O'Brien escaping or fighting back. We waited until O'Brien left the bar alone around 11:30 p.m. He was drunk, staggering slightly, walking toward where his car was parked 3 blocks away. When he reached a dark section of street with no witnesses, our men moved in fast. 2 grabbed his arms, 1 put a hand over his mouth so he couldn't yell, and we had him in our vehicle within 10 seconds. The whole operation took maybe 15 seconds from first contact to having him secured in the back of a panel truck heading toward the warehouse in the Bronx where Mr. Johnson was waiting. O'Brien was taken to a warehouse that Johnson's organization used for storage and for interrogations that needed to happen away from Harlem, where police presence was too heavy. According to Hewlett, O'Brien was brought into a basement area of the warehouse at approximately midnight on November 14th, where he found Bumpy Johnson sitting at a small table with a pen, ink, and several sheets of paper laid out carefully. According to Hewlett, who was present during the entire confrontation, Paddy O'Brien was forced into a chair across the table from Johnson, his hands tied behind his back, surrounded by 4 of Johnson's men who stood ready to intervene if O'Brien tried to fight or escape. O'Brien was drunk and scared, Hewlett recalls. He knew who Bumpy was. He knew this was about hitting Madame St. Clair at Lecoq D'Or, and he knew that Bumpy didn't kidnap people for friendly conversations. O'Brien tried to act tough at first, saying Dutch Schultz would kill everyone involved if anything happened to him, saying he didn't regret hitting that racial slur and would do it again. But Mr. Johnson just sat there calmly listening until O'Brien ran out of bluster. When O'Brien finally went quiet, Johnson began speaking in a voice that Hewlett describes as calm, measured, and absolutely terrifying in its complete lack of emotion. "Paddy O'Brien, that's your name, right? Paddy O'Brien, age 32, works as an enforcer for Dutch Schultz, lives in Hell's Kitchen with your wife Mary and your 2 children. I know a lot about you, Paddy. I know you've been working for Schultz for 4 years. I know you've hurt a lot of people on Schultz's orders. I know you hate black people. You make that very clear with the racial slurs you use constantly. And I know that 1 week ago, on November 7th, 1931, you hit Stephanie St. Clair in a Manhattan restaurant while she was having dinner. You struck a black woman in the face hard enough to split her lip and knock her gun from her hand. You humiliated her in front of white patrons who watched you assault her without intervening, and you laughed about it. You thought it was funny that you'd put a black woman in her place." Johnson paused, looking directly at O'Brien, and then continued, "Here's what's going to happen now, Paddy. You're going to write a letter to Dutch Schultz. You're going to write in your own handwriting so Dutch knows the letter is really from you. And in that letter, you're going to explain several things. First, you're going to explain that hitting Stephanie St. Clair was the biggest mistake of your life. You're going to explain that you now understand black women deserve respect, that violence against women is cowardice regardless of the woman's race, and that you deeply regret your actions on November 7th. Second, you're going to apologize to Dutch Schultz for bringing trouble to his organization by attacking Madame St. Clair without thinking about consequences. Third, you're going to wish Dutch Schultz goodbye and tell him you hope he lives a long life. And finally, you're going to sign the letter with your full name and the date." According to Hewlett, O'Brien initially refused, saying he wouldn't write anything, that Schultz would come for Johnson, that this kidnapping would start a war that Johnson couldn't win. Mr. Johnson let O'Brien refuse for about 5 minutes, Hewlett says. Then Mr. Johnson nodded to one of our men, who hit O'Brien in the stomach hard enough to double him over and make him vomit. Then Mr. Johnson explained very calmly that O'Brien could write the letter voluntarily, or we could break his fingers one at a time until he agreed to write it. Mr. Johnson said we'd start with O'Brien's right hand, breaking the pinky first, then the ring finger, then the middle finger, until O'Brien changed his mind about cooperating. Mr. Johnson asked if O'Brien understood. O'Brien nodded. Mr. Johnson asked if O'Brien was ready to write the letter now. O'Brien said yes. O'Brien's hands were untied, and he was given the pen and paper. According to Hewlett, O'Brien's hand was shaking so badly from fear and alcohol that his handwriting was barely legible, but over the course of approximately 30 minutes, he wrote the letter that Johnson had dictated, including all the required elements: the admission that hitting St. Clair was his biggest mistake, the explanation that he now understood black women deserve respect, the apology to Shultz, and the goodbye wishes. The letter was pathetic, Hewlett recalls. O'Brien was crying while he wrote it. His handwriting was terrible, and the letter sounded like it had been written by a child rather than by a grown man. But it contained everything Mr. Johnson wanted: a confession that O'Brien had made a terrible mistake, an acknowledgement that black women deserve respect, and a goodbye to Dutch Schultz that made clear O'Brien wouldn't be working for Shultz anymore. O'Brien signed and dated the letter. Patrick O'Brien, November 15th, 1931. Good, Johnson said, taking the letter and examining it carefully. Now, Patty, I'm going to explain what happens next. This letter is going to be delivered to Dutch Schultz at his office. He's going to read about how you realized that hitting Stephanie St. Clair was the biggest mistake of your life. He's going to read your goodbye, and he's going to wonder where you are and why you disappeared right after writing this letter. He's going to search for you. He's going to ask questions. He's going to hear rumors, but he's never going to find you, Patty, because you're never going to be found. You're going to disappear from this moment forward. Your wife will report you missing. Police will investigate but find nothing. Dutch Schultz will assume I killed you as revenge for hitting Madame St. Clair, and he'll be right, except your body will never be recovered, so he'll never be able to prove it. You're going to become a ghost, Patty, a missing person whose fate is unknown, but whose absence sends a very clear message to Dutch Schultz and to anyone else who thinks they can put their hands on black women without consequences. According to Hewlett, O'Brien began begging at this point, promising he'd leave New York, swearing he'd never work for Schultz again, offering to give Johnson information about Schultz's operations if Johnson would spare his life. Mr. Johnson listened to O'Brien beg for maybe 2 minutes, Hewlett says. Then Mr. Johnson stood up and said, "You should have thought about consequences before you hit Madame St. Clair. You should have understood that black women have protectors who don't forgive violence against them. You should have known that working for Dutch Schultz doesn't make you untouchable. But you didn't think about any of that. You just saw a black woman and thought you could hit her without consequences because you're white and she's not. Well, Patty, here are your consequences." And then Mr. Johnson nodded to our men, and they took O'Brien to another part of the basement where what needed to happen happened. I wasn't present for that part. Mr. Johnson didn't want details. He just wanted O'Brien gone in a way that would send the right message. On Monday, November 16th, 1931, 2 days after Patty O'Brien was kidnapped, a messenger delivered a sealed envelope to Dutch Schultz's office in the Bronx. The envelope was addressed to Mr. Dutch Schultz, in handwriting that Schultz's secretary immediately recognized as Patty O'Brien's handwriting. The envelope had no return address. According to sources who were present when Schultz opened the letter, Sources who spoke with the Gazette on condition of anonymity. Schultz's face went white as he read O'Brien's handwritten confession and goodbye. The letter read, according to sources who saw it before Schultz destroyed it. Mr. Schultz, I am writing to tell you that hitting Stephanie St. Clair at Le Coq d'Or restaurant on November 7th was the biggest mistake of my life. I thought I was doing what you wanted by putting that black woman in her place. I thought hitting her would show her and Bumpy Johnson that we don't tolerate uppity behavior from people we consider beneath us. But I was wrong. I realize now that black women deserve respect like any other women. That violence against women is cowardice, no matter what race the woman is, and that my actions brought serious trouble to your organization that I did not intend. I apologize for the problems I have created. I did not think about the consequences when I struck Madame St. Clair. I did not realize that she had protection that would respond to violence against her. I regret my actions, and I regret putting you and your organization at risk. This letter is to wish you goodbye, Mr. Schultz. I hope you live a long and prosperous life. I hope your business succeeds, but I will not be part of that business anymore. What I did to Madame St. Clair has consequences that I must face. I am sorry for everything. Sincerely, Patrick O'Brien. November 15th, 1931. According to sources who witnessed Schultz reading the letter, his initial reaction was confusion. Why would O'Brien write a letter apologizing for hitting a black woman and saying goodbye? But within minutes, as Schultz called O'Brien's home and learned that O'Brien's wife had reported him missing since November 14th, Schultz understood what the letter meant. Schultz knew immediately that Bumpy Johnson had killed O'Brien, says a source who worked in Schultz's organization. The letter was Johnson's way of confirming it while also sending a message. You disrespect Stephanie St. Clair, you put your hands on her, you pay the ultimate price. The letter was brilliant psychological warfare. It confirmed O'Brien was dead without providing any evidence that police could use to investigate, and it forced O'Brien to write a confession that he'd made a terrible mistake before Johnson killed him. Schultz was furious but also grudgingly impressed. Johnson had sent a message that everyone in Schultz's organization understood: don't fuck with Harlem's queen, because Bumpy Johnson will kill you and make you write your own obituary before he does it. Schultz reportedly tried to find O'Brien's body, offering rewards for information, pressuring police to investigate Johnson, searching locations where he thought Johnson might have disposed of a corpse. But no body was ever found. Patty O'Brien simply disappeared from existence on November 14th, 1931, leaving behind only a letter apologizing to Dutch Schultz and acknowledging that hitting Stephanie St. Clair was the biggest mistake of his life. The disappearance of Patty O'Brien and the delivery of his forced confession letter to Dutch Schultz became legendary in both Harlem's criminal underworld and among Schultz's organization. The incident established several important precedents that would shape the coming numbers wore Stephanie St. Clair's status. The violent response to O'Brien hitting St. Clair made clear that she wasn't just another numbers banker who could be intimidated or pushed aside. She had protection, Bumpy Johnson's protection, and that protection was willing to kill to defend her honor and safety. This status made other criminals more cautious about how they dealt with St. Clair, understanding that disrespecting her meant potential death. Bumpy Johnson's reputation, Johnson's willingness to kidnap and kill one of Dutch Schultz's most trusted enforcers, established Johnson as someone who didn't make empty threats. When Johnson said he'd kill you for hurting someone he protected, he meant it literally. This reputation made Johnson one of the most feared men in New York's criminal underworld, despite being only 26 years old in November 1931. The message to Schultz. The letter forced Schultz to acknowledge that his campaign against Harlem's numbers operators wouldn't be easy, that Harlem had defenders who would respond to violence with violence, and that attacking black women would trigger responses that might cost him valuable personnel. The numbers war would still happen. It was inevitable given Schultz's determination to control Harlem's gambling, but Schultz entered that war knowing it would be more costly and more dangerous than he'd initially expected. That letter became famous in criminal circles, says Theodore Green, who worked as an attorney for both St. Clair and Johnson during the 1930s. Everyone knew about it. Patty O'Brien's forced confession and goodbye, written in his own hand hours before Bumpy Johnson made him disappear forever. The letter became a symbol of what happened when you disrespected Stephanie St. Clair. It became a cautionary tale that Schultz's men told each other, "Don't touch Harlem's queen, because Bumpy will make you write your own obituary, and then he'll kill you, and nobody will ever find your body." That letter probably saved St. Clair's life multiple times during the numbers war, because men who might have considered killing her remembered what happened to Patty O'Brien and decided that killing her wasn't worth the risk of Bumpy Johnson's revenge. The numbers war between Dutch Schultz and Harlem's independent operators would rage throughout 1932 and 1933, resulting in dozens of deaths, massive property destruction, and ultimately Schultz's partial success in taking over many of Harlem's gambling operations. But Stephanie St. Clair would survive, in large part because Bumpy Johnson's response to the Le Coq d'Or incident made clear that killing her would trigger retaliation so severe that even Dutch Schultz, at the height of his power, didn't consider it worth the risk. Patty O'Brien's body was never found. His wife filed a missing persons report that was never resolved. Police investigated, but found no evidence of foul play and no leads about O'Brien's whereabouts. The case went cold within months. But everyone in New York's criminal underworld knew what had happened. Everyone knew that O'Brien had made the fatal mistake of hitting a black woman that Bumpy Johnson was sworn to protect. Everyone knew that Johnson had made O'Brien write a letter confessing his mistake before making him disappear. And everyone knew that the letter delivered to Dutch Schultz was Johnson's way of saying, "This is what happens when you disrespect Stephanie St. Clair." In Harlem today, elderly residents who remember the 1930s numbers wars still tell the story of the night Dutch Schultz threatened Stephanie St. Clair at Le Coq d'Or, of the bodyguard who hit her and knocked her gun away, of Bumpy Johnson returning from the restroom with his gun pressed to Schultz's head, and of Patty O'Brien's disappearance 1 week later after being forced to write a letter confessing that hitting St. Clair was the biggest mistake of his life. The story has been told and retold for decades, becoming legend, becoming myth, becoming the definitive example of Bumpy Johnson's loyalty to Stephanie St. Clair and his willingness to kill anyone who disrespected her, regardless of how powerful or dangerous that person's employer might be. That night at Le Coq d'Or defined the relationship between Bumpy and Madame St. Clair, says Green. Bumpy wasn't just her enforcer. He was her protector in the deepest sense of that word. He was willing to risk war with Dutch Schultz to defend her honor. He was willing to kill one of Schultz's top men to send the message that she was untouchable. And that protection was mutual. St. Clair protected Bumpy's interests, promoted his career, made him wealthy and powerful. They were partners in the truest sense, and the Le Coq d'Or incident showed everyone in New York's criminal underworld that their partnership was based on mutual respect and loyalty that went beyond just business. The letter that Patty O'Brien was forced to write, the confession that hitting Stephanie St. Clair was his biggest mistake, the acknowledgement that black women deserve respect, the goodbye to Dutch Schultz, written hours before O'Brien disappeared forever, became one of the most famous documents in Harlem criminal history, despite the fact that Dutch Schultz destroyed the original within days of receiving it. Because everyone who heard about the letter understood what it represented, that in November 1931, at a fancy Manhattan restaurant, a white bodyguard made the fatal mistake of putting his hands on a black woman that Bumpy Johnson protected, and that mistake cost him everything. That was November 7th, 1931. That was the night Dutch Schultz learned that disrespecting Stephanie St. Clair carried consequences he couldn't afford. That was the letter that Patty O'Brien wrote hours before he vanished forever. That was the message Bumpy Johnson sent to everyone in New York's criminal underworld. Touch the people I protect, and you'll disappear without a trace after writing your own confession about why attacking them was the biggest mistake of your life.